Without a doubt, the lightsaber is one of the most recognizable weapons of all time. Even non-Star Wars fans recognize them on sight. But for such an iconic weapon, not many people know the history and technology behind them. As you might expect from a contained plasma sword, lightsabers were complicated tools, and when you add crystals and the Force into the mix, things get strange fast. We're willing to bet that even you, the viewer, will learn something new. In today's video, we'll be diving deep into the lore surrounding Jedi lightsabers, from a brief overview of their history to what components were necessary for them to function, different variations one could make using different styles, the entire ritual behind its construction, and last but not least, the crucial philosophy that any Jedi had to internalize before they were ever allowed to come near a lightsaber, never mind build one.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Despite how intrinsically the lightsaber is connected with the idea of the Jedi, it wasn't the first weapon of choice the Order standardized. In its early years, the Jedi Order relied on a type of Force weapon sometimes referred to as a Jedi katana. To make their very own Force weapon, the Jedi would take a bar of high carbon metal, usually durasteel, and then forge it into a katana-like sword. During the forging process, the Jedi had to concentrate on imbuing the weapon with the Force, pouring energy into the blade as it took shape. This altered the blade's molecular structure, resulting in an almost unbreakable material that was unbelievably sturdy, but also unbelievably sharp. After the blade had been forged, a Force-attuned crystal would be set into the sword's hilt by channeling the Force into it and the weapon until the two became one. Once the process was complete, the blade would glow. The resulting blade was nigh impenetrable, capable of parrying energy weapons and cutting through most substances. This entire process was highly personalized, and thus, the weapons each Jedi forged was unique to them, much like lightsabers were in later years. But with the advancement of technology, more intricate and powerful weapons were slowly developed. Sometime between 10,000 and 7,000 BBY, the Jedi began developing the first lightsaber prototypes by focusing raw energy through Force-attuned crystals built into cylindrical hilts, which would result in a blade of pure energy. These were the proto-sabers, the beta version of the lightsaber. They were mostly similar to modern lightsabers, but were more unstable and needed to be connected to an external belt-worn power pack that was connected to the proto-saber by a power cable. However, the Jedi worked on refining this new type of weapon, and by the outbreak of the 100-year darkness in 7000 BBY, the proto-saber had completely replaced the Jedi katana. 2000 years after that, lightsaber technology had developed further, and the first modern lightsabers were constructed. These didn't require an external power source, which made them far more viable as a weapon. When the Sith adopted the lightsaber, they began a tradition of using red-colored sabers, which we'll get into a little later. During the Great Sith War, many Jedi who joined Exar Kun kept their Jedi sabers, which had their original colored crystals, but the Jedi Civil War reintroduced the concept of an army of Sith wielding exclusively red lightsabers, and the Crimson Blade became a staple for the Sith moving forward. For the rest of its history, the lightsaber remained mostly the same. Advancements in technology provided new materials for their hilts to be made out of, or new sources of crystals might be discovered, but the lightsaber itself, in concept and practice, remained unchanged, a stable reference point for a Jedi Order that underwent many reformations. So let's take a look at what this final design looked like and which components made up this signature weapon. As many of you probably know already, the way a Jedi constructed their saber was deeply personal to them, reflective of their personality, their history, cultural backgrounds, and fighting styles. However, regardless of the designs they picked, each lightsaber was made up of the same basic components. The average lightsaber hilt was between 24 and 30 centimeters long, though this could also vary wildly depending on the user's size. Regardless of its length, every mechanism that worked together to produce the lightsaber was housed within the hilt. All in all, most lightsabers consisted of 10 components in total, each with a very specific order of placement within the hilt. At the very top was the blade emitter, a lens that covered the lightsaber's energy beam into a blade of superheated plasma. The emitter also forced the plasma to loop back in on itself. There were many emitter designs a Jedi may choose, from a simple cylinder to crescent moon shapes curving outwards or spikes that protruded outwards. Part of this structure was the emitter matrix, which kept a tight magnetic grip on the beam of energy once it was extended. During the saber's construction, it was crucial that this matrix was oriented the right way, because if it wasn't, the blade would be sent inwards instead of outwards, causing the saber to explode. Right beneath the blade emitter was the focusing lens. This lens's job was to regulate the length of the lightsaber blade, ensuring it would stop at a set distance. These were responsible for shorter lightsaber blades, such as those for smaller-bodied Jedi, and for the blades of Exar Kun's famous saber staff, whose length he could alter mid-combat. Beneath the focusing lens were the energy modulation circuits and the cycling field energizers. Not much is known about their exact role in the saber's function, but the former most likely functioned as tools to convert the energy of the saber into plasma. Nestled within a specialized chamber in the heart of the saber was the focusing crystal, a placement directly tied to the crystal code. The crystal is the heart of the blade. Much like in their first iterations, these force-attuned crystals were arguably the most important part of the lightsaber and the one that carried the most significance for the Jedi. Alongside the crystal, all sabers also had an energy core. Canon and legends differ here in what role these two components played together. According to canon sources, the lightsaber crystal focused the energy produced by the power source, resonating as the energy passed through it and giving the blade its properties. For example, Kylo Ren's saber used an unstable crystal, which gave the blade that characteristic flickering look. Most sabers were built with one focusing crystal and two power crystals, the latter of which strengthened the blade and granted it unique properties in some cases, but one would also work just fine. The energy core, typically a rechargeable Datium power cell, was what powered the saber, sending energy through the focusing crystal. In legends, however, the crystal itself was the source of the saber's power, and the power came directly from it. Meanwhile, the energy core was little more than a battery that was used to activate the saber. However, beyond turning the saber on, the energy core didn't supply the saber with energy per se. Rather, an activated lightsaber functioned as a closed circuit, with energy looping from the battery through the blade and then back to the battery. It's up to you which version you find the most logical. For the purposes of this video, we'll be going with the Legends explanation, but whenever we encounter any other differences between the two sources, we'll still be pointing them out. Beneath the power cell was the inert power insulator. This component was added to protect the saber user from any energy discharge. Finally, at the base of the saber hilt was the pommel cap, which was another highly customized component. Its primary purpose was to seal the bottom of the hilt, but oftentimes a backup power cell was stored in the pommel just in case a Jedi was caught unprepared. But this was all inside the hilt. Externally, the hilt had many other customization options, such as personalized grips, ridges, textures, and so on. Many sabers had a power button which activated the saber, but these weren't mandatory. In fact, sabers could be activated with the Force alone. Another external mechanism was the blade power adjustment knob, which moderated the power output of the saber. Thanks to this knob, the lightsaber could go from powerful enough to cut through durasteel to training mode, which was the lowest power setting used during training. When in training mode, the blade was so weak that if it came into contact with sentient skin, it would cause a mild burn and nothing more. So how did all these components work together to make a saber's blade function? First, the energy cell would be activated, sending a stream of energy through the kyber crystal which focused it. This would be converted into plasma, then refined through a series of field energizers and modulation circuits before the emitter took all that and turned it into a solid beam of energy. The The blade would extend about 1 meter in length on average before the containment field forced it to arc back in on itself toward a negatively charged fissure around the emitter. From there, it was channeled back toward the power cell through superconductors, which would close the circuit. The containment field was also responsible for making the blades feel solid when connecting with other lightsabers rather than passing through each other. As we mentioned earlier, variations in these individual components could change the overall lightsaber design, even if the core mechanics remained the same. These design changes evolved into the different types of lightsaber variations. We've already dedicated an entire video to the different kinds of light weapons the Jedi have used across the ages, but for the purposes of this video, we'll go over a few basic ones. First, there's the curved lightsaber. Rather than the hilt being a straight cylinder, in the case of this specialized tool, the saber's hilt formed a curve that could fit within the palm of the hand and tilt downward, allowing for the saber's blade to essentially become an extension of the user's arm. The curved hilt was usually wielded by dedicated Form 2 practitioners like Count Dooku, whose curved lightsaber is the go-to example for this weapon. Another basic variation that depended on changes to these basic components was the Great Saber. In principle, the Great Saber was identical to a lightsaber, just larger. The hilt was longer and wider, and the blade was designed to extend beyond the usual length of a lightsaber. Great sabers were necessary for larger species, as the length of a saber was directly proportionate to the user's size. Along the same vein was the Shoto, a lightsaber with a shorter hilt and blade. For some Jedi, this was used as an offhand complement to the regular lightsaber main hand, but for some Jedi of smaller stature, the Shoto replaced the lightsaber as the main hand. Yoda was a good example of this, as his saber was significantly smaller to match his tiny frame. Another famous canon example was the vented or crossguard lightsaber, also known as that crossblade Kylo Ren uses. In the case of this saber, the emitter wasn't designed to just emit the blade, but also two smaller blades on either side to form a crossguard. Along a similar vein was the double-bladed lightsaber, which featured a double-ended hilt. Rather than the hilt having the emitter at the top and the pommel cap at the bottom, once we reached the power cell, the structure repeated until we reached a second blade emitter at the other end, allowing for two blades to exist at the same time. These were independent of one another and could be activated separately if the wielder wanted, offering greater range and flexibility. On a slightly different note, another way a Jedi could personalize their lightsaber was by waterproofing it. It's unclear what exactly a Jedi had to do to make a saber waterproof, but amphibious species, like the Nautilans, famously ensured their lightsabers could function underwater. As a final and more extreme example of a lightsaber variant was the Light Whip, a weapon that resembled a lightsaber hilt, but the blade it emitted was longer and whip-like. The difference here was in the containment fields and energizers, as they allowed for different shapes, lengths, and flexibility to the emitted blade. At the end of the day, no matter what bells and whistles you added to your lightsaber, the most important part of it was the crystal, the heart of the blade. But as you already surely know, these weren't just random crystals you bought at a market, and they meant a heck of a lot more to the Jedi than their emitter or pommel cap. But before we get into the why, let's discuss the what. What exactly made these crystals special? As we've mentioned, the crystals used for lightsaber construction weren't any ordinary crystals. They were incredibly rare, force-attuned crystals, often called living crystals. They were connected to the living force, and through this connection, the Jedi could form bonds with them, but more on that later. The most common form of lightsaber crystal was the Kyber crystal, but other rarer variations also existed. These crystals were nigh indestructible, capable of focusing and amplifying energy. Lightsaber-worthy crystals were found on planets with an extreme concentration of force energy, like Ilum, Ossus, Jedha, or Dantooine. And of course, the color of the crystal is what determined the color of the lightsaber blade. This is another moment in which canon and legends differ. In canon, lightsaber crystals were always clear. When a Force user found one and bonded to it, the crystal would shift color to match the user's personality, thus determining its color. For example, Obi-Wan Kenobi would have found a clear crystal, and after meditating with it, his crystal would have become blue. resulting in his blue lightsaber. In Legends, the color of the crystal was dependent on the type of mineral it was and on the planet it was found. For example, in the icy caves of Ilum, you could only find blue, green, and rarely purple crystals, whereas up on the snowy mountaintops, you could find magenta crystals. On Dantooine, you would commonly find yellow and orange crystals. An extension of this disagreement is the two different ways canon and Legends handle red lightsaber crystals. According to canon, red lightsabers weren't really a naturally occurring option. To get a red lightsaber crystal, the Force user had to take a crystal and bleed it, pouring all their hatred and pain into it. Remember how we said these crystals were connected to the living Force? Darksiders would abuse this connection to break the crystal spirit. Once it resonated with the user's pain and anguish, it turned red as a result. In Legends, on the other hand, there were a very, very rare few naturally occurring red lightsaber crystals, but for the most part, the red crystals used by the Sith and other Darksiders were synthetic. These synthetic red crystals were created in specialized blast forges that allowed Darksiders to channel their anger and hatred into the crystal to shape and refine it, producing a corrupted and utterly unnatural crystal after a few days forging. On the flip side of this difference were white crystals. In canon, you got a white lightsaber crystal by cleansing a previously bled red crystal, whereas in Legends, white crystals were just a very rare type of crystal found in the digestive tract of giant worms, among other places. Now, we're going to spare you the Jedi horoscope game of what does my lightsaber color mean. There are plenty of theories out there for what kind of Jedi got what kind of crystal. Traditionally, Jedi Guardians got blue, Jedi Consulars got green, Jedi Sentinels got yellow, Mace Windu got purple, and everyone else got whatever made them feel extra special. In reality though, regardless of whether you vibe most with canon or Legends, the color of the crystal didn't matter. What mattered was the bond between them and the Jedi, the unbreakable, unique connection that took the crystal from a piece of living mineral to the heart of the saber, and the Jedi from a single person to the crystal of the Force. But before the Jedi could attune their crystals and begin constructing their sabers, they first had to actually collect their crystals. In some cases, this was as simple as hunting down a mineral and collecting it. However, it was common for older Jedi and mandatory for the children collecting their first crystal ever to go about collecting their crystals through a ritualistic process known as the Gathering. We're sure you remember the eponymous episode of Star Wars: The Clone Wars, where a group of younglings, supervised by Master Yoda, traveled to Ilum to collect their first lightsaber crystals. The Gathering ritual could be performed in other crystal caves, such as on Jedha or Dantooine, but traditionally, the Jedi preferred the icy caverns of Ilum, so we'll be focusing on those as an example. Naturally, this wasn't as easy as walking into the caves, picking up a crystal, and walking back out. Lightsaber crystals were found on planets strong in the Force, and through their connection to it, the Force was an active participant in the ritual, testing the hopeful Jedi venturing into its depths. As shown in The Gathering and Jedi Fallen Order, there was a deliberate way the crystal caves had been prepared. The entrance to the cavern was sealed by a thick sheet of ice that prevented anyone from entering or leaving. At the entrance to the caverns, the Jedi had built a mechanism that used prisms to focus the sunlight from Ilum's sun and channel a focused beam at the entrance that could melt the ice. However, from the moment the ritual began, the Jedi within were on a timer. The moment the sun moved out of position, the sunbeam would cease hitting the door and the thick plating of ice would reform, trapping the would-be crystal prospectors within. That's why the Gathering was a time-sensitive ritual, or at least that's how it was presented to the Padawan. Be quick or be trapped within. We'd like to believe Jedi teachers weren't so cruel that they would actually leave a Padawan trapped inside, but that's a topic for a different video. Once a Jedi entered the caves, they had one sole objective: finding their crystal. Again, this wasn't just any crystal. In a glittering cavern filled with glowing crystals, the Jedi had to open themselves up to the Force, allowing it to guide them in the right direction. What determined the right crystal for a specific Jedi wasn't its size or shape or color, but the Force resonance it gave off, its connection to the Force, and through it, to the Jedi. By opening themselves up to the Force, however, a Jedi was simultaneously tested. As it guided them, so too did the Force test them. Within the crystal caves, a Jedi had to face their darkest fears and insecurities. Thoughts that sounded like their innermost doubts would whisper through their minds, testing their resolve. In short, the Force would make a Jedi confront their weaknesses and fears, and only by overcoming them and persisting in the face of doubt, only by trusting in the Force would a Jedi succeed and find their way to their crystal. And once they'd found the crystal that was destined for them, it was a matter of reaching out and plucking it from the rock. With their crystal now in hand, the Jedi began the simultaneously arduous and simple task of constructing their lightsabers. There were two different aspects to constructing a lightsaber: physically selecting and assembling the components, and spiritually attuning the crystal. Despite their vastly different nature, both processes relied heavily on the Force. When selecting the components for their lightsabers, Jedi were encouraged to personalize their hilts as much as possible. In the Star Wars The Clone Wars episode immediately following the gathering, A Test of Strength, the young Jedi who had just collected their first crystals were guided by Huyang, the ancient saber artificer, on how to construct their first saber. In the case of these younglings, Huyang simply brought out a giant box filled with components of all shapes, sizes, and materials. Instead of rifling through the box and choosing their components, the younglings were taught instead to meditate on the Force and allow it to guide them in selecting their pieces. Rather than focusing on what looked cool or other superficial factors, Huyang taught them that what they needed to listen to was their heart and allow their sabers to reflect who they were on the inside. Only then would the saber truly reflect who they were as Jedi. Regarding the components themselves, these could be from a variety of materials, from durasteel to wood. Huyang and the Crucible, the ancient Jedi ship that he was in command of, had many different textures and styles on hand to allow for maximum optimization. As an example from this episode on the series, the Wookiee Padawan Gungi ended up selecting components made from the wood of the Brylark tree, which reflected his cultural origins on Kashyyyk. We have to assume that, as the Jedi grew older, wiser, and more aware of their specific needs, the assembly process was much more deliberate. A Makasha user, for example, would intentionally go for a curved hilt. A Jedi that wanted to build a lightsaber blaster combo would intentionally choose those components. However, there was still an element of letting the Force guide them in constructing it, even if it was to a lesser degree than that very first time a youngling built their lightsaber. To an extent, the rituals surrounding that first lightsaber assembly were a necessary part of a young Jedi's education. The lightsaber, after all, was the symbol of the Jedi Order. Wielding it wasn't a right, but a privilege, and the many layers of ritual that went into building it were there to truly impress upon the Padawan the true importance and gravitas of the moment. From the moment they pushed their activator buttons and turned on their lightsabers for the very first time, they were a representative of the Jedi Order in the galaxy, wielding a tool powerful enough to cut through metal and vaporize flesh. It was a responsibility the younglings could not take lightly, and the many elders who guided them along the way were there to ensure they understood just how important this moment was. On the other hand, attuning the lightsaber crystal to themselves was a far more difficult process. A test of strength doesn't show the process, but we have other depictions of it. In the past, we've discussed how the Force was living energy that permeated every living being, forming connections between us. It was the task of the Jedi, who represented the will of the Force, to strengthen those connections. By doing so, they supported balance and life itself. The crystal attunement process was an extension of this same concept. By allowing themselves to enter a deep meditative state, the Jedi would reach through the Force and find that connection between themselves and the crystal that had chosen them. To attune the crystal, they had to strengthen that connection between themselves and the crystal until their bond was so strong that they were one. A good mental image is that, before the attunement process, the Jedi and the crystal each resonated at their own unique frequency. By deepening their bond, these two frequencies came ever closer until the Jedi and crystal resonated as one. When younglings were first taught how to attune their crystals, they were taught the Crystal Code, an offshoot from the main Jedi Code. The crystal is the heart of the blade. The heart is the crystal of the Jedi. The Jedi is the crystal of the Force. The Force is the blade of the heart. All are intertwined. The crystal, the blade, the Jedi. You are one. In 7 short lines, the crystal code embodies this very notion that the Jedi and crystal are a single unit, a pair bonded for life, profound connection forged through the Force itself. It is the Force that connects the pair, but it is the crystal and the Jedi that resonate together. This profound connection is the basis for the canon lore that it was the Jedi's personality that determined the color of the crystal. Simultaneously, it's the reason why a Jedi just couldn't select any random crystal. The Force guided them to that crystal that was already very close to their own frequency, a crystal that was already close to reflecting their spirit. By guiding the crystal to mirror them more, a Jedi poured themselves into it, and depending on what type of person they were, the crystal would change to reflect their inner selves. Only once their crystals were fully attuned were the Jedi ready to activate their sabers. It's unclear which of the two processes came first. We would argue it doesn't matter, really, but it would make more sense to us if the longer, more difficult attunement process would come first. For starters, the attunement process was one of self-discovery. Through it, the Jedi had to take a good look at themselves in order to imprint that upon their crystal. Throughout the process, they would become more familiar with who they were as a person, and by extension, they would better understand their needs in a lightsaber. A secondary aspect is that Padawan constructed their first lightsabers when they were still young, and it would be far easier to have the crystals ready to slot into their completed hilts once they were done rather than have them wait. Either way, once the crystal was attuned and slotted securely into the completed hilt, all the Jedi had to do was activate the saber and watch it come to life. Assuming everything had been done correctly and the lightsaber didn't explode in the Jedi's face, they now wielded a weapon of a legendary power. We doubt we really need to go into extreme detail to truly impress upon you just how powerful the lightsaber was. Since the lightsaber's blade was made up of a continuous stream of superheated plasma, it could essentially cut through most materials. Jedi were able to cut through heavy blast doors or slice rifles in half like they were nothing. There were only a handful of materials that were lightsaber resistant, such as Beskar, Frick, and Cortosis, but they were extremely rare and expensive, leaving most opponents with no way to Jedi-proof their equipment and facilities. Since they could be made waterproof, not even hiding your facility underwater could protect against the cutting power of the lightsaber, as the Inquisitorius found out. When striking a living creature, the lightsaber's blade was so hot it vaporized a clean path through whatever it touched. When used to amputate a limb, the lightsaber left behind a wound so thoroughly cauterized the victim wasn't at risk of bleeding out. On the other hand, if an opponent used the lightsaber against you, there were very few armors that would do anything to protect you. Stormtrooper armor, for example, was as easy to slice through as styrofoam with a chainsaw. And even if that weren't enough, the Jedi were very thoroughly trained to wield their weapons. Millennia of Jedi had perfected the various schools of lightsaber combat, otherwise known as the 7 lightsaber forms. If you haven't seen our video on each individual form explained, we highly recommend it. To keep a long story short here, each form represented a different school of thought and a different response to a specific need. Makashi, for example, was designed to deal with Shicho's sweeping motions. Ataru was designed to overwhelm Makashi users. Shien was developed to counter Ataru and deal with multiple opponents at once. As the millennia passed, the Jedi adapted to their opponents, making them formidable enemies in every period. All you have to see to understand just how OP Jedi were is to rewatch The Phantom Menace and see just how much of an impact the arrival of Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon has on the Battle of Naboo. Jedi were incredibly powerful, more powerful than any other individual warrior, and oftentimes more powerful than entire platoons of individuals. But as an old uncle might say, with great power comes great responsibility. Jedi weren't only taught how to use their lightsabers, but also when. And the philosophy behind the use of lightsabers is one of the most fundamental yet least talked about aspects of Jedi ideology. At the core of this philosophy lies the principle that Jedi should only draw their lightsabers when absolutely necessary. To many Jedi, this was the single most important lesson when it came to lightsaber combat, and thus, the principle was named Form Zero to symbolize that it was the basis that knowledge of all other lightsaber forms should be built upon. There are many quotes that encompass this idea scattered through canon and legends. A Jedi should only draw their lightsaber if they are prepared to kill, is one such quote that many of you are likely familiar with. Kyle Katarn mentions that, remember, your lightsaber is an invaluable tool. Even when inactive, it can diffuse a potentially volatile situation. Trust me on that. While Yoda reminded younglings that the best blades are kept in their sheaths. All of these quotes illustrate the same core idea. A lightsaber is a tool, not a weapon, and as such, it should only be used when necessary. Diplomacy was the true purpose of the Jedi, not combat, and rushing to draw one's lightsaber when more peaceful means were available could easily escalate a situation into violence. The true purpose of the lightsaber was to be a symbol of justice in the galaxy, not a vehicle for violence and domination as the Sith used it. Sometimes, Form Zero taught, just the presence of a Jedi and their lightsaber could be enough to deter other participants from escalating a situation, and in this case, the threat of the lightsaber was more than enough. The first quote we mentioned is a fan favorite precisely because of how potent it was. Given how powerful a lightsaber was, a Jedi couldn't draw it on their opponent without knowing that a possible outcome has now become them taking their opponent's life. As Jedi, the keepers of life, this wasn't an outcome any Jedi should take lightly, and if they weren't prepared to kill, they shouldn't be drawing their weapons first. What Form Zero called for was restraint, discipline, and deliberation. A Jedi had to weigh all their options, trusting in the Force to guide them into seeing options that might not be immediately obvious. If there was another way to diffuse a situation without escalation, then a Jedi was expected to find it. If not, they were expected to use aggressive negotiations only to the point they were absolutely necessary. To many practitioners of Form Zero, it was the first form a youngling had to learn before they could receive any further instruction in martial skills. Otherwise, young Jedi ran the risk of impulsively throwing themselves into combat and becoming what some in the fandom call saber monkeys, Jedi who could do little more than resolve a situation with violence. Of course, a Jedi could wield their weapon in self-defense when needed, or in the defense of others. At the end of the day, the lightsaber was a tool to be used for the good of the galaxy. A symbol of the Jedi Order that upheld the will of the Force, a tool capable of as much good as destruction. It was up to the Jedi to live up to that responsibility. So, there you have it. Did you learn anything new about lightsabers? Do you prefer the way canon or legends handle the lightsaber crystals? Is there anything else related to the lightsaber that you'd like us to cover in the future? Feel free to let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.